Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes alive. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. The setting sun cast long shadows through the old pines, darkening the weathered Victorian house. Deep in the Berkshire Mountains, the house sat surrounded by a fortress of towering trees, their branches scraping against aged clapboards. From Lindsay's upstairs bedroom windows, she saw nothing but dense forest pressing in from all sides, an endless sea of dark green that seemed to whisper with each breeze. The trees grew so close that their uppermost branches nearly touched her windows, though she knew no tree actually stood near enough to reach them. Lindsay knew early on that she preferred a life of solitude to the hustle and bustle of family life. No husband to answer to or pick up after. No children to ferry to soccer practices or baseball games. Just her and Luna, her black cat. The companionable silence they shared was all she needed as she craved the freedom to focus solely on herself, to cultivate a life of peace and comfort. She had just bought this house, the first step to achieving her dreams. A crumbling Victorian mansion nestled deep within the woods, a place that both excited and terrified her. Excitement bubbled within her as she imagined the possibilities. A cozy library filled with her beloved books, a garden overflowing with fragrant blooms, and long, peaceful evenings spent by the crackling fireplace. A reclusive writer who penned dark Gothic novels, she hoped to find solace in the solitude of her mountain retreat. The silence of the forest, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl, would allow her to delve into the depths of her imagination, crafting stories that reflected her own introspective nature. Each creak of the old Victorian house, each whisper of the wind through the trees, would become fodder for her dark and twisted tales. The isolation, a source of fear for others, would become her muse, fueling her creativity and allowing her to explore the darker corners of the human psyche. The realtor had told her that the previous owner had just vanished without a trace, which wasn't uncommon in the Berkshire Mountains. Though the Berkshires were mostly a beautiful and safe place, it did have its share of mysteries and folklore. Lindsay, however, found this intriguing rather than off-putting. The whispers of vanished residents and tales of hidden creatures only added to the allure of the place, fueling her imagination and providing a rich tapestry of inspiration for her writing. That all changed the first night she spent alone in her new home. As night settled over the Berkshires, Lindsay unpacked the last of her boxes. The moonlight filtered through the bare branches, casting strange, shadowy shapes on her bedroom walls. Her cat Luna perched on the windowsill, staring intently into the darkness. The old house creaked and settled around her as she changed into her nightgown. A cool autumn breeze rustled the curtains, and she pulled them closed, leaving just a sliver of moonlight to illuminate her room. She wasn't afraid of the dark. She wrote about it for a living, after all. Climbing into bed, Lindsay pulled out her laptop to work on her latest novel. The soft glow of the screen cast an eerie light across her face as her fingers danced across the keyboard. Luna suddenly tensed, her tail puffing up. That's when she heard it, a gentle tap against her second-story window. At first, she dismissed it as a branch, but there was something deliberate about the sound. Luna leaped from the windowsill and darted under the bed. The tapping continued, more insistent now, and Lindsay realized with growing unease that there were no trees close enough to touch her window. The tapping grew faster, more urgent. Lindsay's heart raced as she slowly turned toward the window. Through the gap in the curtains, she could make out what looked like fingertips pressing against the glass, leaving faint smears. She froze. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was impossible. No one could reach her second-story window without a ladder. Yet there they were. Long, pale fingers. Too pale, too thin to be human. The curtain moved slightly, as if something was trying to peer through the gap. Luna hissed from under the bed. Lindsay's laptop slipped from her trembling hands as she watched a face press against the glass. A face that didn't look quite human. It was hairless, and the mouth and eyes seemed to melt as its skin sagged. With shaking hands, Lindsay grabbed her letter opener and crept toward the window. The face vanished, but the smears remained on the glass. She slammed the window shut, forcing herself to breathe slowly. "Just a raccoon," she whispered, though raccoons didn't leave fingerprints. Or a bear cub. But bears couldn't climb vertical walls, and they didn't look like that. Maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her, the semi-sheer curtain distorting her view. The next morning, golden sunlight streamed through the windows as Lindsay examined the glass. The smears were still there, long, dragging marks that looked almost oily. She ran her finger along one, finding it oddly cold to the touch. Luna prowled the windowsill, fur slightly raised, batting at something invisible in the air. The cat's strange behavior made Lindsay's skin prickle. Maybe it was frost, she muttered, wiping the window with cleaning spray. But the smears wouldn't come off completely, leaving faint rainbow-like streaks across the glass. She spent the morning in town, buying extra deadbolts and locks for the windows and doors, though a nagging voice reminded her that locks wouldn't stop something that could climb walls. But she refused to let strange wildlife, or even the unknown, scare her away from her dream home. When Lindsay went to the hardware store, the elderly clerk eyed her address on the receipt. "The old Victorian up on Black Mark Road?" he asked, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Folks don't tend to stay there long. Something about the windows, they say." He paused, glancing at the cans of cat food she had laid on the counter next to the deadbolts, and seemed to be weighing his next words. "You got a cat? Keep it inside after dark." Lindsay hurried home, his words echoing in her mind. When she arrived, she found Luna sitting in the hallway, staring intently at the ceiling. After installing the locks, she settled down on the old couch she had bought at the thrift store in town and tried to focus on her novel, but found herself distracted by the imagined movements from the corner of her eye that seemed to disappear when she looked directly at them. That night, the temperature plummeted unusually low for autumn. Beneath the house's familiar creaks and settling, something scraped against the outer walls, methodically testing each window before moving higher. It was another sleepless night. The next few days blurred together as Lindsay barely slept. Luna had abandoned her usual sleeping spots, instead perching on high shelves and windowsills, her yellow eyes tracking invisible movement. At dusk on the third day, while making tea in the kitchen, Lindsay caught a glimpse of something pale moving past the window. By the time she turned, it was gone, leaving only a faint fog on the glass. Luna's tail puffed up as she let out a low growl. Each morning, Lindsay found new evidence that something had visited in the night. Smudges on windows, scratch marks on sills, and once, a single pale handprint high on the kitchen window. Too long-fingered to be human. She scrubbed at them until her arms ached, but the oily residue refused to fade completely. The house felt like a cage now, with something circling outside, testing for weakness. At night, she heard it moving along the walls, its movements too fluid, too purposeful to be any natural creature. The sounds always stopped at her windows, followed by that gentle, persistent tapping. Sleep continued to elude her. Every creak and groan of the old house made her jump, and Luna refused to leave the space under her bed. Around 3 a.m., the scraping sounds stopped, replaced by absolute silence. Even the usual forest sounds had gone quiet. Morning brought little relief. The oily marks had spread to every window on the ground floor, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Luna wouldn't go near them, hissing whenever Lindsay tried to clean the glass. After several more sleepless nights, Lindsay found herself searching online for security companies. The hardware store's deadbolts weren't enough. She needed to see what was out there, to prove to herself that she wasn't imagining things. When she found positive reviews for a local company that specialized in unique security challenges, she made the call. Then she found the number for the real estate agent. After dialing the real estate agent's number, Lindsay waited through 3 rings before Amy Peterson's cheerful voice answered. Her earlier enthusiasm about the charming historic property had dimmed when Lindsay asked about the previous owner.
Well, that was quite strange,"
Amy admitted.
"Mr. James Hartford bought the place in 2019. Quiet man. Kept to himself. Then last October, his sister reported him missing. Police found the house empty. Dinner still warm on the table. TV on. Car in the driveway. No signs of forced entry. They searched the woods for weeks."
Amy paused.
"The oddest thing, though, every window was covered in these weird greasy marks, like someone had pressed their hands all over them. The cleaning crew couldn't get them off completely."
Lindsay's throat went dry as she glanced at the similar marks now decorating the windows. Did they ever find him?
"No, the case is still open. Listen, Miss Parker, if you're having second thoughts about the house—"
Lindsay hung up, her hands trembling as she opened her laptop to search for more information about James Hartford's disappearance. Lindsay scanned the local news article from 2 years ago. It wasn't about James Hartford, but instead a local man named Jerry Pitts, who described being dragged through his bedroom windows by a pale, elongated figure. The police had dismissed his story, attributing it to drug use or mental illness, but the details matched what she had seen. The oily marks, the impossibly long fingers. At the hardware store, the elderly clerk, Tom, grew serious when she asked about James Hartford. "Fourth one to vanish from the Berkshires since '85, he said quietly, glancing around the empty store. After the second disappearance, folks started talking about things that tap on windows at night. The police files are sealed, but the library keeps old newspapers. You might want to check those, especially around October. They seem to get more active when the weather turns cold." Lindsay headed to the town library, her mind racing. If she could understand the pattern of disappearances, maybe she could protect herself. Maybe she could avoid becoming the next victim of whatever stalked her windows at night. In the library's archives, Lindsay pieced together a disturbing pattern. 8 disappearances since 1985, all from homes near the Berkshire woods. Each victim lived alone. A divorced architect, a widowed teacher, 2 writers, and others who'd chosen solitude. Police reports mentioned the same oily residue on windows, but investigators blamed wild animals or runaways. Lindsay's hands shook as she read about Emily Warren, a poet who vanished in 1992. Like Lindsay, she had moved to the Berkshires seeking isolation to write. Her diary, found after her disappearance, described pale watchers at her windows in the weeks before she vanished. The connection was clear. These creatures targeted those who wouldn't be immediately missed. Lindsay realized her own isolation, once a comfort, now made her the perfect prey. The security company van pulled into Lindsay's driveway just as Luna darted beneath the living room sofa. The cat had been increasingly agitated since the window incident, refusing to go near any glass surfaces after sunset. "Quite a place you've got here," the technician said, stepping out of his van. His name tag read Mike. He glanced up at the Victorian's towering windows, his expression darkening. Though those old houses can be temperamental about modern security. Lindsay led him through each room, noting potential camera placements. Mike worked efficiently, mounting cameras with clear views of every window, but he kept glancing at Luna, who watched from various hiding spots. "Your cat seems nervous," he observed, testing a connection. "Animals tend to know things we don't, especially in these mountains." He hesitated while mounting the final camera outside her bedroom window. "Ma'am, if these cameras catch anything unusual, don't try to investigate yourself. Just call the police, and maybe consider mounting some mirrors facing outward." He left her with 8 cameras feeding to both her laptop and phone. That night, Lindsay sat in bed watching the feeds, Luna pressed against her side. Around 2 a.m., the kitchen camera caught movement. A pale, elongated hand pressing against the glass. The figure moved with impossible fluidity, testing each window methodically. Then it looked directly into the camera. Its face was almost human, but wrong. Too angular, eyes too large and entirely black. The feed distorted, pixelating around the creature's form before cutting to static. When the image returned, the camera showed only empty darkness. One by one, each camera failed in sequence, starting from the ground floor and working up. The last feed, her bedroom window, captured a final image before dying. Those long, pale fingers trying to pry open the window. Suddenly she had an idea. Hands shaking, she opened her laptop and began searching. Berkshire supernatural creatures, wall-climbing entities, supernatural window marks. The results mentioned countless local legends, but one term kept appearing: wall crawlers, entities that preyed on people that lived in isolated homes in the mountains, marking their territory in glass before claiming their victims. As she read, Luna suddenly hissed at her laptop. In its reflection, something pale moved across the glass. Lindsay whirled around, but her bedroom window was empty. When she looked back at the laptop, she saw it clearly. A distorted face with black eyes watching her through the screen's reflection. She slammed the laptop shut and scrambled backward, dragging Luna with her. The cat's warning hiss turned into a yowl as something scraped against the window behind them. But again, when Lindsay turned, nothing was there. The creature had vanished, scared away by its own reflection in the laptop screen. Lindsay remembered Mike's words about mirrors. After a frantic late-night search online, she found references to reflective surfaces repelling supernatural entities. The wall crawlers, according to folklore, couldn't bear to see their own twisted forms. The next morning, she drove to the antique store and bought every vintage mirror she could find. She mounted them strategically, large ornate ones facing outward from each first-floor window, smaller ones angled to protect the second floor. The Victorian's exterior now bristled with reflected sunlight. The next night, she heard the familiar scraping, followed by an inhuman shriek. Through her bedroom window, she glimpsed a pale figure recoiling from its own reflection, its elongated form distorting as it tried to avoid the mirrored surfaces. But her victory was short-lived. The next morning, she found the largest mirror shattered, its pieces scattered across the lawn. Back inside, heart pounding, Lindsay returned to her laptop research with newfound urgency. Deep in occult forums and local folklore sites, she found descriptions that made her blood run cold. Wall crawlers didn't just kill their victims, they transformed them. The creatures would swallow people whole, digesting them for days before regurgitating new wall crawlers, twisted beings that had lost all trace of their former humanity. Each victim became another predator, driven by an insatiable hunger to create more of their kind. After discovering the horrifying truth about wall crawlers, Lindsay called the sheriff's office in desperation. She recognized Sheriff Dan Matthews' patrol car pulling up. He had been checking on her regularly since they had moved in, often bringing coffee and local honey from his wife's beehives. At 62, he had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in these mountains, and eyes that had seen too much to dismiss anything outright. "Remind me of the Hartford case." He caught himself, straightening his worn leather jacket. But that was probably just vandals. Matthews had investigated half a dozen disappearances during his 30 years as sheriff. Each time he had found those same oily marks, impossible to clean. Each time he had filed reports blaming wildlife or runaways. But Lindsay saw doubt in his eyes as he studied her security footage. "Listen," he said finally, his calloused hands gripping his coffee cup. "My grandmother used to tell stories about things in these mountains that, well, maybe you should stay with Sarah and me for a few days. The guest room's always ready." He paused. "Living alone up here, it can play tricks on your mind. But sometimes—" He stopped as Luna hissed at something outside the window. "I'm not crazy," Lindsay snapped. But the words sounded hollow even to her. "Just please check the house." The sheriff found nothing except her collection of mirrors facing outward from every window. He left her his card, concern etched on his weathered face. That night, everything changed. With her largest mirror already destroyed, Lindsay had fewer defenses when the wall crawlers launched their final assault. The remaining mirrors exploded inward at 3:17 a.m. She remembered checking her phone at the first crash. A wet, leathery sound dragged across glass as the creatures methodically destroyed her last protections. Through her bedroom window, she saw them. Pale, elongated figures flowing up the walls like spilled milk in reverse. Their bodies moved wrong, joints bending backward as they crawled. Where their fingers touched the glass, they left glistening trails that seemed to pulse in the moonlight. The closest wall crawler pressed its face against her window, its flesh sagging like melted wax, its jaw unhinged, revealing rows of translucent teeth, and its black eyes reflected Lindsay's terrified face back at her. The glass began to crack beneath its touch, spreading in spiral patterns that matched the oily fingerprints. More of them emerged from the darkness, their bodies impossibly thin, stretching and contorting as they climbed. Some had faces that looked almost human. Perhaps they had been, once. Luna's fur stood on end as she backed away from the windows, hissing at the creatures that now surrounded the house on all sides. The mirror's destruction reached a crescendo, each one exploding inward as though the wall crawlers couldn't bear their own reflections. Glass rained down as elongated fingers, too many fingers, began prying at the window frames. The wood creaked under their strength, and the temperature in the room plummeted until Lindsay could see her panicked breath in the air. With trembling hands, she dialed the number to the sheriff's office, clutching Luna to her chest. As the creatures methodically destroyed her defenses, she could hear them communicating in wet, clicking sounds that made her teeth ache. The window frame splintered. The sheriff arrived just as the last mirror shattered. His flashlight beam caught a pale, twisted figure crawling headfirst down the Victorian's facade. "Dear God," he whispered, reaching for his weapon. The wall crawler moved with impossible speed. It dropped onto his patrol car, its body contorting as it flowed. There was no other word for it. Toward him. Sheriff Matthews fired twice, but the creature's form simply rippled around the bullets like smoke. "Get inside!" Lindsay screamed from her doorway, but it was too late. The wall crawler's jaw unhinged, stretching grotesquely wide. The sheriff's scream cut off as the creature began to swallow him whole. Lindsay ran, Luna tucked under one arm, her vanity mirror clutched in the other. She sprinted for her car. More wall crawlers emerged from the shadows, their pale forms illuminated by the patrol car's flashing lights. They recoiled from her mirror's reflection, giving her precious seconds to reach her vehicle. She fumbled with her keys, Luna hissing warnings at the approaching creatures. The wall crawlers circled her car, their black eyes reflecting in every window. Just as one reached for the door handle, Lindsay started the engine. She floored the accelerator, tires spraying gravel. In her rearview mirror, she saw the twisted figures growing smaller, still gathered around the sheriff's empty patrol car. Lindsay drove straight to the sheriff's office, her hands trembling on the wheel. The only person there was Deputy Mark Reynolds, a young officer who'd grown up in the Berkshires. When she burst in with her wild tale, he didn't dismiss her like she'd expected. "My grandpa used to tell stories about things in these mountains," he said quietly, his face pale in the fluorescent light. "Things that climb walls and take people. I never believed them until I saw the Hartford case evidence. Sheriff Matthews was like a father to me." Deputy Reynolds said, his jaw tight, "I need to see for myself before we call this in." He grabbed his rifle and followed Lindsay back to the Victorian in his patrol car. The wall crawlers had vanished, but the oily marks remained, along with the sheriff's empty vehicle and his service weapon on the ground. Reynolds touched the strange residue on the patrol car's window, his hands shaking. "My grandpa was right all along," he whispered. Only then did they craft their story for the state police. A break-in, an assault on the sheriff, signs of a struggle. Reynolds made the call himself, his voice steady despite his grief as he reported an officer down. When the state police arrived, there was no sign of the wall crawlers. They had left only their oily marks and the sheriff's empty patrol car as evidence. The case remains unsolved in official records, though Deputy Reynolds still keeps watch over the mountain roads at night. Lindsay drove straight to Boston, not stopping until sunrise. She sold the Victorian at a loss, moved into a busy apartment complex, and took a job that required daily human interaction, even though she still writes at night. Luna adapted well to city life, though she still hisses at windows after dark. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, Lindsay wonders about Sheriff Matthews, whether he became one of them, another pale figure testing windows in the Berkshires. But she keeps those thoughts to herself. After all, she learned the hard way that isolation attracts them, and she'll never live in isolation again. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows, your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.